My name is Julia Foster. I'm 34 years old, and on a Friday night in November, at my parents' kitchen table in Columbus, Ohio, with a roast chicken going cold in the center of the table and my mother's best white wine already halfway gone, a man named Anthony Gordon put his hand on my leg under the tablecloth and looked me directly in the eyes while he did it. He was calm. That was the part I'll never forget. Not nervous, not furtive. Calm. The specific calm of a man who has done this before and learned that nobody stops him. I looked back at him for exactly 2 seconds. I said, "Jason Willis." The fork in my sister Audrey's hand stopped moving. My mother looked at me the way she'd been looking at me since I was 7 years old, the look that said I had just done something unforgivable at the exact wrong moment, which in my family was any moment that interrupted the story she was trying to tell about us. And Anthony, Jason, let a breath of silence pass before he tilted his head and smiled and said he wasn't sure what I meant, that maybe I was thinking of someone else. That smile. I've thought about it 100 times since. It wasn't the smile of an innocent man confused by a false accusation. It was the smile of a man running a calculation, measuring the room, measuring me, measuring how much he had to work with. He'd done this before. He'd been in rooms where someone almost figured it out. He knew how to wait. What he didn't know was what I did for a living, what I'd spent 8 years learning to find. And here's the thing about that moment. I wasn't angry. I wasn't scared. I was something I'd never quite felt at that table before, in that house, in that family. I was completely, absolutely calm. Not his kind of calm, mine. The kind that comes from finally understanding what you're looking at. If you've ever seen something that nobody else in the room was willing to see, type "witness" in the comments. This story is for you. To understand that Friday night, you have to understand what it meant to grow up a foster in Columbus. We weren't wealthy. My father, Harry Foster, 62 years old, managed facilities for a mid-sized distribution company for 30 years. Steady work, health insurance, 2 weeks of vacation, the kind of career that doesn't get a LinkedIn post but keeps a mortgage paid and the lights on. My mother, Marilyn Foster, 60 years old, worked part-time at a dental office for most of my childhood and spent the rest of her energy constructing the narrative of what the Foster family was and where it was going.
Marilyn was not a cruel woman. I want to be precise about that because cruel is too simple. She was a woman who had decided somewhere along the way that the story of her family was the most important thing she had, and that anything which complicated that story, any inconvenient fact, any achievement that didn't fit the arc she'd written, any daughter who kept turning out different from what she'd imagined, was a problem to be managed rather than a truth to be examined. The story of the Foster family, in Marilyn's version, had one main character. Audrey Foster, 29 years old, was everything the story needed. She'd graduated from Ohio State with a business degree in 2017, moved up fast in a Columbus tech company called Vertex Solutions, and by 27 she was a manager of operations, real title, real salary, real company car allowance. She was sharp and socially fluent, and she laughed at the right times and wore the kind of clothes that said, "I've arrived," without shouting it. She still lived at home, which Marilyn described as a smart financial decision while saving for a place of her own, and which meant that Marilyn saw Audrey every day and could narrate her success in real time to anyone who would listen. I was the other daughter. 4 years older, working at a law office, doing something with documents that nobody fully understood and therefore couldn't fully appreciate. I had my own apartment on the east side of Columbus, a one-bedroom that I'd furnished slowly over 5 years and which I was proud of in the quiet way of someone who has learned not to announce her pride too loudly. I was doing fine, better than fine if anyone had been paying close enough attention to look. Nobody was paying close enough attention. When Audrey was promoted to manager at 27, my mother organized a dinner for 23 people, catered trays, a custom cake, a card that everyone signed at the table. My father gave a toast that went 8 minutes and ended with him pulling Audrey into a hug that made half the table tear up. When I made senior paralegal that same year, a promotion I'd worked toward for 5 years, with a formal letter of commendation from the senior partner that I keep in a folder I've never shown anyone, my mother said, "That's wonderful, honey," from the kitchen while she was loading the dishwasher. My father said, "Good for you, kiddo," and asked what was for dinner. I don't tell you this to make you angry on my behalf, though I understand if the feeling arrives anyway. I tell you because this was the pattern: steady, invisible, automatic. Not malicious, just a family that had already decided where the light was supposed to fall and adjusted everything else accordingly.
It had been that way since we were children. I remember a Saturday in June, the summer I was 12 and Audrey was 8, when my father took us both to the Columbus Clippers game. A rare outing, deliberately special, the kind of afternoon where everything is supposed to feel equal. I had been looking forward to it for 2 weeks. I'd written it on the calendar above my desk. In the fourth inning, Audrey said she wanted cotton candy, and my father got up immediately. He came back with 2 bags, one for Audrey, one for himself. I looked at the bags for a moment. My father didn't notice. He was already watching the field. I'm not sure he even knew he'd done it. That was always the precise texture of it. Not the cruelty of deliberate exclusion, but the specific carelessness of someone whose attention had a preferred destination and redirected there automatically. I spent years trying to decide which was worse. I still haven't landed on an answer. What I know is that by the time I was 16, I had stopped expecting to be in the center of anything in that house. I'd found other places to put my attention: schoolwork, a part-time job at a copy shop on the weekends, the particular self-sufficiency that forms in kids who figure out early that waiting to be noticed is a strategy with a very poor return rate. I was good at most things I tried. I just learned gradually and without any single dramatic moment that being good at things didn't automatically make the people nearest to you pay attention. Sometimes it did the opposite. Sometimes being competent and quiet and reliable made you the piece of furniture that the room was arranged around without anyone stopping to ask how the furniture felt about it. And then there was Anthony Gordon. He came into Audrey's life in September. A mutual connection from a networking event, she said, a private investment consultant who worked with high net worth clients across the Midwest. He was 40, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that announces itself before the conversation starts. He wore a watch that cost more than my monthly rent and had an answer for everything, always delivered with just enough hesitation to seem thoughtful rather than rehearsed. My mother loved him within 20 minutes of meeting him. I watched her fall at that first family dinner in October, and I recognized it. The same way she'd fallen for Derek, Audrey's previous boyfriend, the man whose $3,800 in unpaid loans to my father I'd found in the family bank statements 2 years earlier and spent 6 months being told I was imagining. Anthony was smoother than Derek, more polished, more patient. Looking back, the patience should have been the first sign. I've worked at Hargrove and Associates on North High Street in Columbus for 8 years. I started as a general paralegal at 26 and moved into the civil litigation track within 18 months. By year 4, I was handling complex case files, the kind that require coordination across jurisdictions, cross-referencing public records from multiple states, and the ability to build a picture from fragments that don't initially look related. I'm the person the attorneys call when something needs to be found by morning. I have access to legal databases that the general public doesn't know exist. I've spent 8 years learning the architecture of how people hide things, in paperwork, in names, and the gap between what's registered and what's true. At family dinners, I work at a law office doing documents. 3 weeks before the November dinner, a case came across my desk on a Tuesday afternoon. The client was a woman named Renata Simmons, 41 years old, a pharmaceutical sales manager from Cincinnati with a solid income and a precise, heartbreaking complaint. She had been approached 8 months earlier by a financial consultant who called himself Anthony Gordon. Over 4 months, he had positioned himself as a trusted advisor, then as a romantic partner, and then, with the careful patience of someone who had done this before, had guided her toward transferring $47,000 into a private investment vehicle that dissolved with him when he stopped returning her calls. The documents listed his legal name, Jason Willis, 40 years old. The case file included a photo pulled from a social media profile that had since been deleted. I stamped the intake form. I looked at the photo for a second, registered it, filed it somewhere in the back of my mind with the automatic efficiency that 8 years of caseload builds, and moved on. I have thought many times since about that second, about how close I came to not connecting it at all. If Anthony had not put his hand on my leg at that dinner table, I might never have placed the face. I might have spent months watching my family fall in love with a man I'd unknowingly processed paperwork against. But he did put his hand on my leg, and when I looked at him, something in the calculation of that smile triggered the memory before I could stop it. Jason Willis, Cincinnati, $47,000. They had no idea I'd spent 8 years learning exactly how to find people. The pattern started long before Anthony Gordon arrived. I want to walk you through it carefully because it matters, not just for this story, but for understanding how a family can watch someone and still not see them. When I was 24 and Audrey was 19, she started dating a guy named Marcus during her freshman year at Ohio State. Marcus was 22, personable, full of plans that he described in great detail but never quite seemed to execute. He came to Christmas that year and my mother gave him a stocking with his name on it. She had not given any of my previous boyfriends a stocking. I brought someone home for Easter when I was 25. His name was Kevin and he was a paralegal like me, thoughtful and funny, and the kind of person who asked follow-up questions and meant them. My mother spent the meal asking about his 5-year plan with a tone that suggested no 5-year plan he offered would be quite sufficient. My father talked to the television during the game afterward. Kevin and I dated for another year before other things intervened. My mother never mentioned him again after we broke up, which told me she'd already filed him in a category that didn't require further storage. Then there were the $3,800. 2 years before Anthony, Audrey was dating a man named Derek, not Marcus, a different one, though the pattern was familiar enough. Derek was charming in the way of someone who needs charm to compensate for something, and over the 8 months he and Audrey dated, he borrowed money from my father twice. I only knew because I helped Harry with his financial paperwork, his health insurance, his retirement statements, the bank accounts that he's never fully navigated online. The transfers were there in the statements, $2,200 in March, $1,600 in June, both described as loans, neither accompanied by any documentation. I brought it up to my mother at the end of that summer, carefully, with the statements printed, the numbers circled. I said I'd noticed the transfers and wanted to make sure the family was protected. Marilyn looked at the papers the way she looked at things that disrupted the narrative, not with curiosity, but with something closer to offense. She said Derek was going through a difficult time. She said Audrey needed support right now, not someone undermining her relationship. She said that sometimes, and she said this with the particular gentleness that my mother reserved for her sharpest observations, Julia had a tendency to look for problems where there weren't any. Derek and Audrey broke up 5 months later for reasons that had nothing to do with the money. The $3,800 was never repaid. My father never asked for it. And I kept that in the same place I kept everything else, the folder in the back of my mind full of things I'd witnessed and never been believed about. That was the pattern, not cruelty, just a family that had decided I was the one who complicated things, who found problems, who couldn't let people be happy. A family that had been practicing that conclusion for so long that they could execute it without thinking. Which is exactly why, when I said Jason Willis at the dinner table that November, not one of them hesitated for even a moment before choosing his version over mine. The dinner itself had started the way those dinners always started. My mother's roast chicken, the good wine that only came out for occasions she considered important, Audrey in the chair she'd sat in since childhood, Harry cutting the meat with the focused calm of a man who was most comfortable when he had a task. Anthony was at the table as he'd been every Sunday for 6 weeks, installed in the seat next to Audrey with the ease of someone who had stopped being a guest and started being a fixture. I'd been watching him for those 6 weeks, not dramatically, just the way I watch anything I'm trying to understand. The way he positioned himself in conversations, never dominating, just guiding. The questions he asked my father about the company's retirement structure. The way he'd started, gently, mentioning a private fund he worked with that had been delivering strong returns for clients. Something Harry might want to know about. No pressure, just something to keep in mind. That particular night, he'd arrived with a bottle of Bordeaux that he set on the counter with the practiced ease of a man who understood that a well-chosen gift communicates more than the gift itself. He'd asked my father about a back problem Harry had mentioned the previous week, followed up specifically, remembered the detail, asked whether the physical therapy had helped. My father's face when Anthony asked that question was the face of a man being seen. I recognized it because I hadn't often seen my father make it in my direction. Anthony was very good at producing that face in people. He leaned across the table at one point while my mother was in the kitchen and told Harry quietly that he'd been thinking about their conversation, that the fund he'd mentioned might be worth a real sit-down, that returns had been particularly strong in Q3, and that he didn't want Harry to miss a window because of timing. He said it the way you say something to a friend, not a target. Low voice, genuine seeming warmth, the body language of someone sharing something valuable rather than selling something dangerous. My father nodded slowly, said that sounded interesting. I was sitting 3 feet away. I was watching the architecture of it assemble itself in real time, and I still didn't have the name connected yet. Then the hand. Under the table, calm and deliberate, and entirely confident of its own impunity. I said the name, and what happened next was so fast and so practiced, Anthony's slight smile, his measured denial, the tilt of his head, that the room moved before I could say another word. Audrey looked at me with the expression I'd seen all my life, the expression of someone who has already decided which side she's on. My mother said, "Julia, this is dinner. This is not the place for this." My father put his hand on my forearm and said it quietly, "Not now." Not now. I said I must have been mistaken. I picked up my fork. Anthony smiled at something Audrey said. My mother refilled his wine. I left at 8:30. In my car, I sat for 19 minutes without moving. Not crying, not angry. Thinking. Running the sequence. The face in the photo, the case file, $47,000, Cincinnati, 3 weeks ago. I drove home. I opened my laptop. I started building the file. 3 days later, I sent my family an email with the case documentation attached, the intake form, the photograph, the records from Indiana and Kentucky, the name Jason Willis with his date of birth and last known addresses. I wrote 3 sentences above the attachments. I said I wanted them to have this information. I said I understood it was hard to hear. I said I hoped they would look at it carefully before making any decisions. My mother replied in 40 minutes. She said that legal documents could be wrong, that photos could be coincidental, that she was not going to let me turn a difficult personal issue into a reason to damage Audrey's relationship. She said she loved me, but that this behavior was becoming a pattern. Harry didn't respond. That was the moment I stopped explaining myself and started building the file the right way, the way that doesn't depend on anyone believing me before the evidence is complete. I need to tell you about Gina Caldwell, because without her, this story is lonelier and also less complete. Gina and I have been friends for 12 years. We met at 22 in the break room of a temp agency in downtown Columbus, where we were both waiting to be assigned to something we hoped would become permanent. She has worked at a medical clinic on the West Side for 9 years now, scheduling and administrative coordination, work that requires patience and precision and the ability to manage multiple crises simultaneously without the institutional credit that the work deserves. She is not a lawyer. She doesn't have access to legal databases. What she has is a memory like a transcript and a commitment to showing up that I have never once seen her waver from. She was in the hospital corridor in March of 2021 when I had appendicitis, sitting in a plastic chair at 11:30 p.m. because I'd called her from the ER and she'd arrived before the IV was in. My parents were at a dinner celebrating Audrey's promotion. I hadn't wanted to interrupt. Gina showed up without being asked twice and stayed until the discharge paperwork was signed at 2 in the morning. She called me on my birthday at 8:07 in the morning, every year. Not because she'd set a reminder, she just knew. The way you know things about people you've been paying attention to for a long time. When I told her about the dinner, the hand under the table, the name, the silence, the way the room moved to Anthony's version so fast it was like watching a reflex. She didn't say, "Are you sure?" She didn't say, "Maybe he just looks similar." She said, "Tell me everything from the beginning." And then she went quiet and listened the way people listen when they're genuinely taking something in, not waiting for a break to offer their own interpretation. When I finished, she said, "What do you need me to do?" That question, I've turned it over many times since because it sounds simple and it's not. It's the question of someone who has already decided that what you've described is real, who has already done the work of believing you, and who has moved directly to the practical question of what comes next. I had not heard that question in that tone with that quickness from my family in more recent memory than I could name. I told her I was building a documentation file, that I had the legal records from the original case but needed broader coverage, social media activity, posts that might be deleted, behavioral patterns visible in Anthony's public profiles that matched the documented approach with previous targets. Gina said, Send me his name and every account you can find." Over the following 3 weeks, we worked at my kitchen table most evenings. I would get home from Hargrove at 6, heat up whatever I had in the refrigerator, and by 7, Gina would arrive with her laptop and a coffee she'd stopped for on the way. We didn't have a dramatic war room setup, just two women at a small table with their laptops open and the kind of focused quiet that forms between people who have known each other long enough to work in silence without it feeling like distance. Gina mapped his social media presence across platforms, LinkedIn, Facebook, an old Instagram account he hadn't fully scrubbed, and identified 4 women who had commented on his posts in the past 2 years and then gone conspicuously quiet. Not unfollowed, not blocked, just silent. The specific silence of someone who has quietly stepped back from an association they no longer want visible. She cross-referenced the timing of those silences with the dates in my legal files. 2 of them aligned closely enough to be significant. She saved screenshots methodically before posts could be deleted. She found a version of his name, A.W. Willis Gordon, listed on a professional directory in Indianapolis from 2019 that he'd apparently forgotten to scrub. She located a LinkedIn connection in Louisville with a mutual contact who, when Gina sent a careful, non-identifying message, confirmed she'd had a professional interaction with the consultant matching his description, that it ended with money she'd never recovered and the restraining order she'd eventually let expire. One night, around 10:30, Gina pushed her laptop back and looked at the spreadsheet we'd been building and said, "How many people has he done this to?" I said, "At minimum 6 that we can document, probably more." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And your family looked at what she sent them and said it was probably a coincidence." I said, "Yes." She looked at the spreadsheet for another few seconds. Then she opened a new tab and kept working. That was the moment I understood what it meant to have someone in your corner who wasn't there out of obligation. Gina didn't have to be at my kitchen table at 10:30 on a Wednesday. She didn't have to spend her evenings learning the architecture of financial fraud to help me prove something to a family that had already decided not to believe me. She was there because she thought it mattered, because she thought I mattered, because 12 years of paying attention had built a kind of loyalty that didn't need to announce itself or ask for recognition. It just showed up, with a laptop and a coffee, and stayed until the work was done. For the first time in years, I wasn't doing it alone. After I sent the email and received my mother's response, and Audrey's message, and my father's silence, I stopped pushing. I answered my mother's texts with, "Doing fine, busy week," and nothing else. I didn't call on Sunday. I declined a dinner invitation with a work conflict that was real enough to be accurate. My mother sent a photo from a Sunday afternoon, Harry and Marilyn and Audrey and Anthony at a crew soccer game. The 4 of them in stadium seats with foam fingers, Marilyn's arm around Audrey, Anthony grinning at the camera like a man who has been fully welcomed into a family story and knows exactly what that access is worth. She captioned it, "So grateful for these people." 3 days later, Audrey posted a photo from a restaurant, the kind of restaurant where the menu list doesn't list prices, leaning into Anthony's shoulder. 340 likes. A comment from a coworker of Audrey's, "He seems so perfect for you." I saved the photo, opened the file, added a line. What I was watching underneath the performance was the acceleration of the approach. Anthony had started attending Harry's Sunday dinners consistently. He had, in the last 3 weeks, mentioned his investment fund twice in conversations with my father, once with a specific reference to a 12% return on a real estate vehicle that his clients in Cincinnati had been very satisfied with. He was building towards something. The timeline was consistent with the pattern in the case files, 4 to 6 months of trust building before the financial ask became concrete. Audrey had a salary, a company car allowance, 3 years of savings that she talked about in front of Anthony at multiple dinners, the down payment she was building, the condo she'd been looking at in the short month, the account she'd been growing since she made manager. Anthony had been listening. I knew he had been listening because that's what the file showed. He always listened, carefully and patiently, until he knew exactly what there was to take. I contacted the attorney at Hargrove who was handling Renata Simmons' case. I asked, carefully within the professional boundaries of my role, whether there were any developments in the investigation beyond the civil case. She told me that the Columbus DA's office had been in contact 2 weeks earlier, that there were now 4 complainants across 3 states, that there was an active investigation. I wrote the case number in my file. I added it to the document I was building. They thought my silence meant I'd accepted it. It meant I finally had enough. Harry's 62nd birthday fell on a Saturday in December. My mother planned a dinner at the house, 16 people, the family's inner circle, the kind of gathering where the table gets extended with the folding section from the garage, and there's always one chair that wobbles. Anthony was there as a matter of course. He arrived with a bottle of wine that cost more than it needed to, and a card for Harry that he'd signed warmly, Anthony, which was the kind of detail I had trained myself to notice. I came with Gina. My mother looked at Gina the way she looked at variables that hadn't been accounted for in her planning, a brief, recalibrating pause. I said that Gina was family, tone flat, factual, no space for negotiation in the sentence. We ate. The conversation moved the way it always moved at these dinners. Harry's work stories, Audrey's update on a project at Vertex, Marilyn's report on what the neighbors were doing. Anthony contributed appropriately at every interval, the rhythm of a man who had learned to read a family's conversational cadence and match it without effort. I watched Gina watch him. She had the expression of someone confirming a hypothesis. When my father opened the floor for birthday toasts, I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I put a manila folder on the table. I said I wanted to share something because I believe that the people in this room deserved accurate information about who they were welcoming into the family. I opened the folder and laid out the pages in a single row across the center of the table, the way I'd seen attorneys do it in depositions, without drama, just evidence given space to exist. The intake form from the Renata Simmons case, a printout of Jason Willis's identification record from the Ohio legal database, 2 prior case summaries, Indianapolis, 2019, a woman named Carol Hester, $31,000. Louisville, 2021, a woman named Patricia Wald, $58,500. A professional directory listing from Indianapolis showing A. Willis Gordon, investment consulting. And the last page, a screenshot of the DA's office case reference number that Gina had helped me format clearly enough to read across the table. I said his name, the legal name, Jason Willis, 40 years old. I said that the man seated at this table had operated under multiple names across 4 states, had targeted women with stable incomes and supportive families who didn't ask hard questions, and had defrauded each of them by establishing romantic trust before redirecting their financial assets into accounts that he controlled exclusively. I said I had tried to share this before. I said I understood how it sounded. I said the documents were there for anyone who wanted to look at them. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then my mother spoke. She said this was unacceptable. She said I had come to my father's birthday dinner and put papers on the table like I was in a courtroom. She said documents could be wrong, that names could be coincidences, that I had been against Audrey's relationships since Derek, and before that since Marcus, and that she was asking me, she stopped and corrected herself, telling me to pick up those papers and sit down and let this family have one evening that wasn't about Julia's need to find a crisis. She said it with the practiced authority of 30 years of managing family narrative. She said it and the room shifted, the wobbling relief of people who had been given permission to choose the more comfortable version. Harry looked at the papers without picking them up. He looked at them the way he looked at things he didn't know how to categorize, with a stillness that could mean anything. Audrey had tears in her eyes that were clearly anger and not grief. She said that she couldn't believe I'd done this here, tonight, like this. She said she knew I had a hard time with her being happy, and she tried to give me the benefit of the doubt. She'd tried for years, but this, she gestured at the papers, this was something else. This was cruelty. Anthony sat with his hands flat on the table and his expression composed. He shook his head slightly, the specific headshake of a man performing injured dignity, and said that he wasn't sure what he'd done to deserve this, that he had nothing but goodwill toward this family, and that if Julia had concerns about him, he would welcome a direct, private conversation at any time. He said it with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been in this moment before and knew how it ended. I looked at him for a moment. Then I picked up my clutch. Gina was already on her feet. I said, "I've said what I came to say. Happy birthday, Dad." I walked to the door. The room let me pass in the silence of people who had chosen their position and were waiting for the disruption to exit so they could resume being comfortable. In the car, Gina didn't speak for a full minute. Then she said, "You did the right thing." I looked out the window at the street I'd grown up on. I said, "I knew." Then I drove home. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time that night. I had the file open on my laptop. I had the DA's case number in my notes. I had done everything I could do within the limits of what I was, a woman without a podium, without institutional authority, without a family willing to receive what she was carrying.
I had laid the documents on the table in front of 16 people, and the room had chosen the version that required less revision of what they already believed. I thought about Carol Hester in Indianapolis, Patricia Wald in Louisville, Renata Simmons in Cincinnati, women who had trusted the wrong person for the same reason my family was trusting him, because he was patient and fluent and very good at making rooms feel like they belonged to him. I thought about whether any of them had tried to tell someone and what happened when they did. What happened next was going to happen without my family's permission. The DA's office had a case number. The investigation was active. The file existed regardless of whether the people at that birthday table had picked up the pages or not. I had done the thing I could do. The rest was going to proceed on its own timeline. I closed the laptop. I went to bed. I set my alarm for 6:15. 2 days later, at 2:37 on a Tuesday afternoon, Gina sent me a link. I was at my desk at Hargrove and Associates, in the middle of reviewing a motion for continuance, when my phone lit up with her message. No words, just the link. Columbus Dispatch, published 14 minutes earlier. Man arrested in Columbus on charges of financial fraud and extortion across 4 states. Jason Willis, 40, was taken into custody this afternoon following a joint investigation by the Columbus Police Department and the Ohio Attorney General's office, conducted in coordination with authorities in Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Willis is alleged to have operated under multiple aliases, including Anthony Gordon and Marcus Webb, targeting women with established incomes through fraudulent investment schemes. Investigators say Willis established romantic relationships with victims over a period of months before soliciting financial transfers into accounts under his exclusive control. The total alleged fraud across all identified cases exceeds $220,000. Willis was located at a residence in the Short North neighborhood. He is being held without bail pending arraignments. I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on my desk, looked at the motion in front of me, and sat very still for about 45 seconds. My phone rang 38 minutes later. My mother. I let it ring. It rang again. Then a text. Julia, call me when you can. Then another. We saw the news. Then, after a silence of 11 minutes, a third. I'm so sorry. I looked at those 3 messages for a long time. 3 sentences. The architecture of an apology from a woman who has spent 30 years building narratives. The careful brevity of someone who doesn't yet know what the words should be, who is reaching towards something true with the tools she has, which are imprecise and insufficient and also all she has. I put the phone in my drawer. I finished reviewing the motion. I sent it to the attorney before 5 o'clock. Then I drove home. Audrey came to my apartment on a Thursday evening, 9 days after the arrest, without calling ahead. I heard the knock and opened the door, and she was standing in the hallway in her work coat, not composed, not performing, just standing there with the expression of someone who has spent 9 days revising a document they thought was finished years ago. She didn't have a speech. She stood in the doorway for a moment and then said, "How did you know?" I said, "I saw the file." 3 weeks before that dinner, his case came across my desk. I looked at his photo for a second and filed it. And then at dinner, I looked at him again and it connected. She was quiet. Then, why didn't they believe you? I said, because I was the one who complicated things. That's the role I'd had long enough that it was easier to fit what I was saying into that story than to look at what I was actually showing them. She didn't argue with that. That was the most honest thing about the conversation. She didn't have a counter version ready. She just absorbed it. She asked if she could come in. I said yes. We sat at the kitchen table for an hour. Not reconciled, that's not the right word. And I want to be careful about the right word. We sat at the kitchen table and had the first conversation I could remember in years that wasn't managed, wasn't performed, wasn't shaped around the narrative of who we were supposed to be to each other. She cried once, briefly, and I didn't tell her it was okay. I let her feel what she was feeling, and I stayed at the table. That was its own kind of starting over. Harry called on Monday morning. He sounded like a man who had written several versions of what he wanted to say and arrived at the conclusion that none of them were adequate and who had decided to call anyway. He said, "I looked at the papers that night.
after you left. I waited. He said, I should have picked them up while you were still in the room. There was a long pause. Not an uncomfortable one. The pause of a man choosing his words from a smaller and more honest vocabulary than he usually used. He said, I'm sorry, Julia. I said I heard him. He said, I see you. I should have been seeing you for a long time. It doesn't fix 34 years. You don't fix 34 years on a Monday morning phone call with a man who is 62 and learning late to use different words. But I believe he meant it, and meaning it is the only place that changing can start. Marilyn and I have spoken 3 times since the arrest. Each conversation has been shorter than the last, but more precise, like she's editing something down to what it actually is, removing the parts that were performance. It's slow, it's imperfect. I'm watching it without expectations. Gina and I had dinner last Friday at a Thai place on North High Street. She ordered the same thing she always orders and talked about a difficult patient family at the clinic and asked about a case I've been working on, and at no point did either of us mention that she had saved screenshots at my kitchen table for 3 weeks that became part of a file that led to the arrest of a man who had stolen $220,000 from women who had trusted him. She knows what she did. I know what she did. We didn't need to say it. Jason Willis was indicted on 7 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of extortion in January. The civil case filed by Renata Simmons proceeded separately. I wasn't a witness. The professional boundaries of my role at Hargrove were clear, but the documentation work I had done found its way to the DA's office through proper channels, and it held up. At my desk at Hargrove and Associates on a regular Tuesday, I processed a new intake form and moved on to the next file. That's what I do. I find things, I document what I find, I trust the evidence over the story that people want to be true. For 34 years, I was a daughter who complicated things, who found problems, who couldn't let things be good. I spent so long trying to understand what was wrong with me that I nearly missed the more accurate question, which is not what's wrong with me, but what does it cost a family to need someone to stay small?
I know the answer now. I've seen the invoice. They needed me to stop seeing clearly so that they could keep believing what was comfortable. And every time I saw something real and said it out loud, I was doing the thing that made me most inconvenient to the story they were telling and most necessary to the truth they were avoiding. There was nothing wrong with me. I just kept looking. If this story landed somewhere real, if you've ever been the one who saw it first and got dismissed for it, I want to hear from you in the comments. What would you have done with those papers on the table? And if you're not subscribed yet, hit the button. I have more stories coming about what it really costs to be the one who pays attention. Thank you for being here.